Picture this. You've just walked away from everything you know, packed a borrowed tent and some questionable trail food, and driven deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains with no real plan except to disappear for a while. That's exactly where I found myself at 29, standing at the edge of what might have been the biggest mistake of my life. It started with a resignation letter I wrote on a Tuesday and submitted on a Wednesday. No backup plan, no savings to speak of. Just this gnawing feeling that if I didn't get out of that office, something inside me was going to break permanently. My boss asked if I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I was. All I knew was that I needed space, silence, and distance from everything that felt suffocating. So there I was, 3 days later, loading my car with gear that looked impressive until you realized half of it was borrowed and the other half came from clearance bins. The backpack still carried the ghost of someone else's deodorant, and my sleeping bag had seen better decades. But it was mine for the week, and that felt like enough. I didn't have a destination, just a vague direction toward the Blue Ridge Mountains and a screenshot of some obscure hiking forum post from 2006. The guy who wrote it mentioned an old forestry trail somewhere west of Lynchburg, maybe near the Tennessee border, accessible through what used to be a logging road. The post had 3 replies, all from usernames that probably belonged to people who still used flip phones. My sister got the rough outline of my plan, which was generous since I barely had one myself. She called me a hermit, reminded me to charge my phone, and made me promise to text when I got back. I agreed, knowing full well that where I was headed probably wouldn't have cell towers anyway. The drive took me through small towns that seemed to exist solely to sell gas and lottery tickets, then onto back roads that gradually shed their asphalt like old skin. By the time I found what I thought was the right turn, I was following gravel that turned to dirt, that turned to something that optimistically called itself a road. I parked where the path simply ended, blocked by a moss-covered concrete barrier that looked like someone's half-hearted attempt at security 20 years ago. There was graffiti on it, so faded I couldn't make out the words. Could have been a warning. Could have been directions to the nearest pizza place. The forest had already started reclaiming the area, with saplings growing through cracks and vines treating the barrier like scaffolding. It was late October, that perfect time when the air carries the promise of winter without delivering on it yet. Every breath felt clean and sharp, like the mountains were exhaling all the accumulated warmth of summer. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of overcast that makes time feel suspended, where noon looks identical to 4 in the afternoon. I followed what started as a deer trail, barely wide enough for single-file hiking, but it paralleled a dry stream bed that seemed to know where it was going. I figured water always finds the path of least resistance, so following its ghost felt like reasonable navigation. Besides, I wasn't trying to get anywhere specific, just away from everywhere familiar. By the time shadows started lengthening, I'd wandered off the trail entirely, drawn by what looked like a decent camping spot on a narrow ridge. The area offered a view down into a vast hollow, thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel, the kind of dense vegetation that seems to absorb sound rather than carry it. Finding a reasonably flat patch near the edge, I cleared some deadfall, wrestled my tent into submission, and settled in for what I expected to be a quiet night. That's when I noticed something that didn't belong. About 10 feet downslope, where the ridge began its descent into the hollow, there was a rectangular patch in the underbrush that stood out like a scar. Too geometric, too deliberate for nature. The lines were too straight, the corners too precise. Whatever it was had been shaped by human hands. Curiosity won over caution, as it usually does when you're alone in the woods with nothing but time and questions. I climbed down to investigate, pushing through scratchy undergrowth until I was standing over what turned out to be a perfect square of stacked stones. 4 low walls, barely rising above ground level, forming an enclosure maybe 3 feet on each side. It wasn't big enough to be a building foundation, but too purposeful to be random. My first thought was some kind of old storage cellar or spring box, the kind of practical structures people used to build into hillsides. But there was no wood, no metal hardware, no signs of decay or abandonment. The stones fit together with precision that suggested recent construction, yet they were already partly buried under years of accumulated leaves and soil. Something about it felt unfinished rather than forgotten. I climbed back to my tent, boiled water for one of those pouches of food that promises to be hearty beef stew, but delivers something closer to salty cardboard soup, and tried to focus on anything other than the strange square below. But it kept pulling at my attention like a splinter you can't quite ignore. Sleep came eventually, sometime around midnight when the forest had settled into that profound silence you only find far from civilization. No traffic, no air conditioners, no electric hum. Just the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not hurried, not stealthy, just deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch through the leaf litter, moving uphill toward my camp. The sound was unmistakably human. Too heavy for deer, too rhythmic for raccoons or bears. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, waiting for the normal sounds that accompany people moving through the woods. A flashlight click, a cough, the rustle of gear. Nothing came. Just footsteps that stopped maybe 20 feet from my tent, followed by absolute silence. I waited, hand gripping the small knife I kept near the tent's mesh pocket. Listening so intently, my ears began creating phantom sounds. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Eventually, exhaustion overrode adrenaline, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning brought no evidence of my midnight visitor, no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The logical part of my mind suggested I'd dreamed it, or misinterpreted some natural sound. But logic felt thin and unconvincing in the gray morning light. Instead of packing up and leaving like a sensible person would have done, I found myself drawn back to the stone square. No plan, no real reason, just a compulsion I couldn't quite name. Before I knew it, I was kneeling in the center of it, brushing away leaves and loose soil with my hands. About 2 inches down, my fingers hit something hard and metallic. It was a hatch, square and rust brown like old iron, fitted perfectly within the stone walls. No handle, just a thin seam running around the perimeter and a slightly raised edge that suggested it was meant to be lifted. The metal was cold in a way that seemed to go deeper than the morning air, like something that had been underground for a very long time. I knelt there staring at it, trying to construct reasonable explanations. Maybe it was an old well cover or access to some forgotten utility line. Mountain communities had all sorts of practical infrastructure hidden in the woods, remnants of settlements that had been absorbed back into the wilderness decades ago. That's when I heard the breathing, not my own. I was holding my breath without realizing it. This was coming from underneath the hatch, slow and measured like someone in deep sleep, but with a ragged quality that made my skin crawl. Breath in, long pause, breath out. Consistent as a metronome, but distinctly, undeniably human. I stood up so fast I nearly fell backward, every instinct screaming at me to get away from whatever was down there. But instead of running immediately, I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might wake up whatever was breathing beneath my feet. I didn't bother with the tent, didn't even look back at my gear. I just grabbed my pack and started walking uphill with the kind of forced calm that comes from being too scared to admit you're terrified. That's when the forest stopped making sense. The deer trail I'd followed in had vanished completely. The dry stream bed curved in directions that defied my memory. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks all looked identical, as if the forest had rearranged itself while I slept. My GPS spun uselessly, searching for satellites that apparently couldn't find me anymore. I marked a tree with my knife, carving a small cross into the bark, then walked straight for 20 minutes. When I found myself standing in front of the same tree, looking at the same fresh cut I'd just made, rational thought began to abandon me entirely. That's when I saw him. A tall figure stood near the ridge where my camp had been, facing away from me toward the hollow. He wore an old green jacket that hung too loose on his frame, sleeves extending past his hands. He stood perfectly still, head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I called out, probably something desperate and stupid, my voice cracking with relief at finding another human being in this impossible situation. But he didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken, just continued his motionless vigil, leaning forward slightly like someone straining to hear a distant conversation. I took a step closer, then another, and that's when I noticed his feet weren't quite touching the ground. Just an inch or two of empty space, barely noticeable, but unmistakable once you saw it. And his coat, it wasn't just hanging loose, it was moving, subtle but constant, as if something underneath was breathing independently of the man wearing it. I ran. No thought, no hesitation, just pure animal panic driving me through undergrowth that tore at my clothes and skin. I crashed through branches, slid down muddy slopes, and followed the sound of running water without caring where it led. Eventually, blessedly, I heard the distant hum of tires on asphalt. When I stumbled out of the tree line onto a paved road, filthy and bleeding from a dozen scratches, I flagged down the first vehicle that passed. The driver took one look at me and asked if I needed medical attention. I told him my car had broken down and I'd gotten lost trying to find help. It was the only explanation that wouldn't get me committed. A park ranger took my statement the next day, professional and patient as he listened to my carefully edited version of events. When I tried to show him where I'd entered the woods, we couldn't find the old logging road or the concrete barrier. According to his maps, there was no trail where I remembered hiking, no access point that matched my description. He suggested I'd gotten turned around, which happens more often than people think in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The terrain can be disorienting, he explained, especially for inexperienced hikers traveling alone. He was probably right, but sometimes, late at night, when sleep won't come, I wonder about that breathing under the metal hatch. I wonder about the man in the green coat and what was moving underneath it. And I wonder if somewhere in those mountains there's still a tent sitting abandoned on a ridge, waiting for someone else to discover what shouldn't be found. The mountains keep their secrets well. Some of them are better left buried. Story number 2. A stranger followed us without speaking for miles in Appalachia. I knew something was wrong when I saw the man standing at the trailhead parking lot staring at us while we loaded our backpacks. He wasn't getting ready to hike. He wasn't doing anything at all. just watching us with this blank expression that made my skin crawl. My girlfriend, Jess, and I had driven down from Pittsburgh for a 3-day backpacking trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. We'd planned this route for months, a remote section of the Appalachian Trail that promised solitude and stunning views, the kind of place where you might not see another soul for days. Maybe that should have been our first warning. The man was probably in his 50s, thin and wiry with greasy gray hair hanging past his shoulders. He wore faded jeans and a stained t-shirt that might have been white once. His boots were old hiking boots, but they looked like they'd walked through hell. What bothered me most were his eyes, pale blue and completely emotionless, like looking into empty windows. "Just ignore him," Jess whispered as we shouldered our packs. "Probably some local weirdo." But as we headed toward the trail entrance, I could feel those eyes burning into our backs. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still watching us. Still hadn't moved an inch. The first few miles were beautiful. Dense forest, babbling creek, the kind of peace you can only find deep in the mountains. Jess and I fell into our usual hiking rhythm, talking about work stress and planning our next adventure. For a while, I forgot about the strange man completely. That's when we heard the footsteps behind us. At first, I thought it was just another hiker catching up. The Appalachian Trail gets plenty of traffic, even on the remote sections. But when I turned around, the trail behind us was empty. Dense forest on both sides, nothing but shadows and tree trunks. "Did you hear that?" I asked Jess. She paused, listening. The footsteps had stopped too. Complete silence except for the wind in the leaves and our own breathing. "Hear what?" "Nothing." "Never mind." We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every few minutes I'd catch the sound of footsteps behind us, always matching our pace, always stopping when we stopped. But whenever I looked back, the trail was empty. After about an hour, Jess heard them too. "Okay, that's definitely someone back there," she said, turning around. "Hello? Are you trying to pass us?" No answer. Just that oppressive silence that felt too heavy for a normal forest. We picked up our pace a little, not quite jogging, but walking faster than comfortable with full packs. The footsteps behind us sped up too, always staying just far enough back that we couldn't see who it was, but close enough that we could hear them crunching through the leaves and snapping twigs. "This is ridiculous," Jess said after another mile. "I'm going to wait and see who it is." She stopped and turned around, hands on her hips in that stubborn way she gets when she's had enough of something. I stopped too, my heart pounding harder than it should have been from just hiking. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 more seconds, then stopped abruptly. We waited 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Nothing. "Whoever you are, this isn't funny," Jess called out. Her voice echoed through the trees, but nobody answered. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. That's when I saw movement in the trees about 50 yards back. Just a flash of something pale between the trunks. A face, maybe, or just a trick of the light, but it disappeared so quickly I couldn't be sure. "Let's keep moving," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. The next few miles were a nightmare. Every time we stopped to rest or check our map, we'd hear those footsteps stop too. When we sped up, they sped up. When we slowed down, they slowed down. Always perfectly matched to our pace, always just out of sight. Worse, I started catching glimpses of him through the trees. Never a clear view, just peripheral flashes that made me question my sanity. A pale face behind an oak trunk, a thin figure slipping between the shadows. Always gone when I turned to look directly. Jess was getting scared too, though she was trying to hide it. She kept checking her phone for signal, but we were too deep in the mountains. No bars, no GPS, no way to call for help. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," she said, but her voice was tight. "Maybe he's just hiking the same route we are. For 6 miles? Without ever getting closer or farther away? Without ever answering when we call out?" She didn't have a response to that. By the time we reached our planned campsite, the sun was getting low and the forest was filling with long shadows. The campsite was just a small clearing next to a creek, barely big enough for our tent. Remote and isolated. Exactly what we'd wanted when we planned this trip. Now it felt like a trap. We set up camp in tense silence, both of us constantly glancing at the tree line. The footsteps had stopped when we stopped, but I could feel eyes on us, watching, waiting. "There," Jess whispered, pointing toward a cluster of pine trees about 30 yards away. "Do you see him?" I squinted into the shadows and my blood went cold. There was definitely someone there. A pale face peering around a tree trunk, barely visible in the fading light, watching us set up our tent with that same blank expression I'd seen at the parking lot. It was the man from the trailhead. He'd been following us all day. "What do you want?" I shouted across the clearing. "Why are you following us?" The face disappeared behind the tree. No answer. No sound except the creek and the evening wind. We debated hiking out in the dark, but we were at least 8 miles from the nearest road, and the trail was treacherous at night. We decided to tough it out until morning, taking turns staying awake to keep watch. I took the first shift while Jess tried to sleep. For hours, I sat outside our tent with a flashlight and our camp knife, scanning the tree line. Every shadow looked like a person. Every branch creaking in the wind sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, I saw him again. Closer this time, maybe 20 yards away, standing perfectly still behind a large boulder. The moonlight was bright enough that I could make out his gaunt features and that 1,000-yard stare. "I can see you," I called out, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "What do you want?" He didn't move, didn't answer, just stood there like a scarecrow watching our tent. I shook Jess awake and pointed. She sat up, looked where I was pointing, and gasped. He was even closer now, standing at the edge of our campsite like he was waiting for an invitation. That's when we noticed the smell, sweet and sickly, like meat left too long in the sun. It was faint, but getting stronger, carried on the night breeze. "We're leaving," Jess whispered. "Right now." We stuffed our sleeping bags and packed our gear in record time, never taking our eyes off the figure at the edge of our camp. He watched us pack, but didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react at all. Just stood there with that horrible empty stare. We hiked through the night by flashlight, stumbling over roots and rocks, just desperate to get away from those eyes. Behind us, I could hear footsteps following at the same steady pace. Never getting closer, never falling behind. Always there, like a shadow that wouldn't detach. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot at dawn, exhausted and terrified. Our car was still there, thank God, but parked next to it was an old pickup truck that hadn't been there the day before. Rusted out, covered in mud, with something dark stained on the tailgate. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the woods. I turned around one last time and saw him standing between the trees, watching us leave with that same blank expression. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or maybe just acknowledging that his game was over. We drove straight to the nearest town and told the sheriff what had happened. He listened politely but didn't seem surprised. Said they got reports like this from time to time. hikers being followed, strange encounters on remote trails. Usually, nothing came of it. "Did he threaten you?" the sheriff asked. "Touch you? Say anything at all?" "No," I admitted. "He just followed us." The sheriff nodded like that explained everything. "Well, following ain't illegal. Not much we can do unless he actually does something." But he did do something. He took our sense of safety in the wilderness. He turned a beautiful mountain trail into a nightmare we'll never forget. We never went back to finish that section of the Appalachian Trail. Every time I think about hiking in remote areas, I remember those empty blue eyes and that sweet, sick smell on the wind. The worst part is not knowing. Why? What did he want? Why did he follow us for miles without ever speaking or getting closer? Was he just some local eccentric or something worse? I still wake up sometimes, thinking I hear footsteps matching my pace in the darkness outside my bedroom window. But that's not where this ends. In fact, what I'm about to share next might be even more disturbing. I knew something was wrong the second I saw it. The lantern. It swung slowly in the dark like someone had just walked away from it, though the trail around us was empty. The flame burned steady, orange against the black tree line, throwing shadows that bent across the Blue Ridge Trail. My stomach knotted. We weren't supposed to see anyone out here. We had hiked 6 hours into the backcountry, far off the tourist routes, into the kind of silence where even the crickets sounded cautious. "Tell me you see that," my friend Mark whispered. I did, and every part of me wanted to turn around. But we didn't. We had been hiking Appalachia for years, pushing further into the wild every summer. We thought we knew these woods, but the Blue Ridge Trail had a reputation. Rangers warned of people getting lost, of maps not lining up with the real paths. But that's what drew us in. We wanted untouched land, stories we could brag about later. Now the bragging didn't matter, because that lantern wasn't just odd, it was wrong. We crouched low, watching. It swayed like it had a rhythm, back and forth, though there was no wind. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't hanging from a tree. It was hanging in the middle of the trail, suspended from nothing. "Let's check it out," Mark said. I grabbed his arm. "No, we leave it. But curiosity is poison." And we were young, cocky, convinced nothing could touch us. So we walked closer. The air got colder with every step. My breath fogged. I could smell kerosene, sharp and chemical, though the flame gave off almost no warmth. I stretched out a hand, but before I touched it, the lantern stopped swinging. Dead still. Mark laughed nervously. Probably someone's prank. That's when the forest went silent. No insects, no rustling, no distant owls, just our breathing, and then, snap. A branch broke in the dark behind us. We spun, flashlights cutting through trees, but nothing moved. When we turned back, the lantern was gone. Not fallen, not extinguished. Gone. We didn't talk after that. We just kept walking until we found a flat spot by a stream and set up camp. But even then, I couldn't relax. The woods pressed close around us, thicker than they had during the day. I kept expecting to see that orange glow return, swinging between the trees. Around midnight, I woke to footsteps outside the tent. Slow, careful, circling us. "Mark," I hissed. He was awake too. I heard him hold his breath. The steps stopped. Silence stretched. Then came a faint scrape, like metal brushing bark. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek, and froze. The lantern was back, hanging from the low branch of a pine not 10 feet away. Its flame burned steady, casting light across the ground. Only this time, I saw something else. Beneath the lantern, the dirt was disturbed. Footprints. Bare. human footprints, leading right up to our tent and stopping. I zipped the flap shut and whispered, "We leave at first light." We didn't sleep. Every creak and whisper of the forest made us jump. But dawn finally came, gray and heavy. The lantern was gone again, but the prints were still there, circling our camp like something had walked around us all night. We packed fast and started back toward the trailhead, but the path didn't look the same. Trees leaned in tighter, branches crossing overhead like ribs. The trail bent in directions that didn't match the map. Every turn felt wrong. By afternoon, we were lost. Mark swore under his breath. "We're going in circles." He was right, because lying in the dirt ahead of us was a crushed patch of leaves, our campfire from the night before. We had walked for hours and ended up in the same place. The lantern waited for us, hanging exactly where it had been. That broke Mark. He grabbed a rock and hurled it, shattering the glass. Flame spilled out, guttered, and died. For a second, I thought it was over, but the air didn't warm. The smell of kerosene thickened until it burned my throat, and from the trees around us came the sound of dozens of footsteps, closing in from every direction. We ran. Branches tore at us, roots grabbed our ankles. My pack split open, spilling gear, but I didn't stop. Behind us, I swore I heard voices, low, overlapping whispers, chanting words I couldn't understand. By some miracle, we stumbled onto a service road near sunset. A ranger truck passed and we flagged it down, wild-eyed, gasping. The ranger drove us back to the station without a word. When we tried to explain, he just shook his head. "You shouldn't have gone down that trail," he said finally. "Some places don't want you there." We never went back, but that wasn't the end. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the trail had bent, the footprints, the whispers. I told myself I needed proof, something real to explain it. So I went back, alone. The parking lot was empty, except for one car, old and dirt-streaked, parked crooked like it had been abandoned. I hiked fast, heart pounding. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. When I reached the clearing, my chest tightened. The branch where the lantern had hung was bare, but the ground was wrong. Leaves pressed down, paths worn in circles, like someone had been pacing for days. I bent to look closer and froze. A scrap of pale blue fabric lay in the dirt, frayed along the edges. I recognized it. It was from Mark's jacket, but Mark had never come back here. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching just behind me. I spun. The trail was empty, but the steps continued circling me. Invisible, steady. My breath came sharp and uneven. Then I saw it. The lantern, hanging from the branch again, swaying gently, flame burning bright. I bolted. The trail twisted in ways I didn't remember, stretching too long, doubling back. It felt like the woods were folding around me, refusing to let me go. When I burst out into the parking lot, I nearly collapsed with relief. But my relief froze the second I saw my car. The driver's door was open. Inside, on the passenger seat, sat the lantern. Soot-stained, cracked, flame still burning steady. I slammed the door and drove until the tank was empty, shaking the whole way. That was 2 years ago. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp. I don't even like driving past wooded areas at night. But sometimes, when I check my rearview mirror, I see it. A faint orange glow, swinging in the dark, following me down the road. And I know the mountain isn't finished with me. It's waiting. Now, move to next story. And speaking of unexplained encounters, Wait until you hear what our next person experienced. I knew something was wrong when the first tap came at exactly 2:17 a.m. Not a knock, not a bang, just a soft, deliberate tap against the bedroom window, like someone testing to see if the glass would break. My wife Sarah and I had rented this cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains for our anniversary. It was supposed to be romantic, secluded, no cell service, just us and nature for a long weekend. The property listing showed a cozy log cabin surrounded by dense forest with the nearest neighbor 3 miles away. What it didn't mention was how the woods pressed right up against the windows, how the trees seemed to lean toward the house like they were listening, how the darkness out there felt thick and alive. The first tap made Sarah stir beside me, but she didn't wake up. I lay still, listening, telling myself it was just a branch scraping against the glass, but there was no wind. The night air was dead calm, not even a whisper of breeze. Tap, tap, tap. 3 more, evenly spaced, like someone knocking in slow motion. This time, Sarah's eyes opened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. The sound was coming from the window right next to our bed, maybe 2 feet from where Sarah's head rested on her pillow. We both held our breath, waiting. Silence stretched for maybe 30 seconds, long enough for me to start relaxing. Then it came again. Tap, 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 tap. 5 this time, in the same rhythm, patient and deliberate, like someone counting. "Check the window," Sarah whispered, but neither of us moved. The curtains were thin and pale moonlight filtered through them. If someone was standing outside, we'd probably see their silhouette. But there was nothing, just the faint outline of pine branches against the glass. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, then slowly pulled back the edge of the curtain. The beam cut through the darkness outside, illuminating the narrow strip of ground between the cabin and the tree line. Empty. Just pine needles and fallen leaves. But the tapping moved. As soon as I let the curtain fall back, the sound shifted to the next window over, the one facing the foot of our bed. Same rhythm, same patient cadence. Tap, 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 tap. "It's following the flashlight," Sarah breathed, her fingers digging into my arm. I killed the light immediately, but it was too late. The tapping continued at the second window, then moved to the third. Someone, or something, was making their way around the cabin, testing each window methodically. "We should call someone," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "No signal, remember?" That's why we picked this place. The tapping had reached the living room windows now. I could hear it moving from pane to pane, always the same pattern, always patient, never urgent or aggressive, just persistent, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. I crept to the bedroom door and peered down the short hallway. The living room was bathed in pale moonlight from the large picture windows that faced the forest. I could see the couch where we'd been cuddling a few hours earlier, the cold fireplace, and the kitchen table where we'd played cards after dinner. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But the tapping continued, moving along the back wall of the cabin now. "Maybe it's an animal," Sarah whispered behind me. "A raccoon or something." But we both knew that wasn't right. Animals don't tap in patterns. They don't move systematically from window to window. And they definitely don't pause between each tap like they're waiting for a response. The sound had reached the kitchen window now, the one over the sink. Through the thin walls, I could hear each deliberate tap echoing in the small space. Then it stopped. Complete silence. Not even the usual night sounds of the forest. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls. Just dead, oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. Sarah and I waited in the bedroom doorway, barely breathing. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. "Maybe they left," Sarah whispered. That's when the tapping started again. But this time it was coming from multiple windows at once. The bedroom window behind us, the living room windows to our right, the kitchen window straight ahead. All of them being tapped in the same steady rhythm, but slightly out of sync, like an echo bouncing around the cabin. Tap, tap, tap from behind us. Tap, tap, tap from the living room. Tap, tap, tap from the kitchen. "There's more than one," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. The tapping grew faster, more insistent. Still rhythmic, but urgent now, like whatever was out there was getting excited, or impatient, or hungry. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd brought, not because I expected trouble, just because Sarah always worried about bears. Now, I clutched it like it was the only thing between us and whatever was circling our cabin. "We need to see what's out there," I said. "Are you insane? We can't just sit here all night. What if they try to get in?" Sarah shook her head, but I was already moving toward the living room. The tapping seemed to follow me, shifting and adjusting as I moved through the cabin. When I stopped in front of the large picture window, all the other sounds stopped too. Just the window right in front of me now. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped the bat tighter and reached for the curtain cord. My hand was shaking, but I forced myself to pull it back. The window looked out into a wall of darkness. The trees were so close I could see individual pine needles pressed against the glass. But, in the reflection of the moonlight on the window, I could make out shapes moving between the trunks. Pale shapes, human-shaped. 3 of them, maybe 4, standing just inside the tree line. They weren't tapping. They were just watching. I jerked the curtain closed and backed, away from the window, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. "What did you see?" Sarah whispered. Before I could answer, the tapping started again. But now it was different, faster, more urgent, and it was coming from every window around the cabin. They were all around us. The sound built to a crescendo, dozens of fingers tapping against glass in overlapping rhythms. It sounded like rain or hail or insects swarming. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. Whispers, soft, barely audible voices mixing with the tapping. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was wrong. Too eager, too hungry. "The car," I said. "We're getting out of here." But when I looked toward the front door, the tapping was coming from those windows too. They had us surrounded. Sarah was crying now, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand. I pulled her close, the bat still gripped in my other hand, and tried to think. The car keys were on the kitchen counter. The front door was maybe 20 feet away. If we moved fast, the tapping stopped. All at once, like someone had given a signal. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. At least with the tapping, we knew where they were. Now, they could be anywhere. We stood frozen in the center of the living room, backs to each other, waiting. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Even the old logs seemed to creak more softly, as if they were trying not to make noise. Then I heard it. The soft scrape of something against wood, coming from above us. "The roof," Sarah breathed. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the cabin roof from one end to the other. More than one set, walking in different directions. They were up there, right over our heads. A piece of dust fell from the ceiling as something heavy shifted above the kitchen. Then another footstep, right over the living room. The chimney, I realized. They're going to come down the chimney. I rushed to the fireplace and looked up the flue. It was dark, but I could hear movement up there. Scraping sounds like claws on metal. And that whispers again, echoing down the chimney like voices in a well. "We have to go now," I said, grabbing the car keys from the kitchen counter. Sarah was already at the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't turn it. The footsteps on the roof were moving faster now, converging over the living room. Whatever was up there was getting ready to come down. I pushed Sarah aside and yanked the door open. The night air hit us like a physical force, cold and thick with that sickly sweet smell of something rotten in the forest. We ran for the car, gravel crunching under our feet. I could hear Sarah sobbing behind me, but I didn't look back until we reached the vehicle. When I did look back, I saw them. Pale figures standing at every window of the cabin, watching us leave. Their faces were pressed against the glass, and in the moonlight, I could see their features clearly for the first time. They looked human, almost, but wrong, in ways that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Too thin, too tall, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. One of them raised its hand and pressed it against the living room window. Its fingers were too long, with too many joints. Then it began to tap. Tap, tap, tap. We drove through the night without stopping, not even for gas until we were back in civilization. We never reported what happened. Who would believe us? We told the rental company there had been a family emergency and left early, but sometimes when I'm alone in our house at night, I hear tapping at the windows, soft and patient and rhythmic, and I wonder if they followed us home. Story 5. I don't know how to start this without sounding crazy, but I'll tell you exactly what happened. It was midnight, and I was driving home from a late shift. The 2-lane road cut through miles of empty woods. No houses, no gas stations, not even cell service. Just my headlights carving tunnels through the dark. I was half asleep, fighting to keep my eyes open when I saw her. A woman, standing dead center in the road. My foot slammed the brake, tires screaming against the asphalt. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd pass out. The car jolted to a stop maybe 10 feet away. She didn't move. She just stood there, pale in the beams, wearing what looked like a long white dress. Her arms hung at her sides, her head tilted like she was listening for something. I rolled the window halfway down. "Hey, are you okay?" No answer. Her skin looked gray, like paper in moonlight. Her hair hung stringy and wet against her face, though the night was dry. I swallowed hard. "Do you need help?" Silence, and then she took one step forward. I panicked, throwing the car into reverse, but before my foot hit the gas, she was gone. Not walking off, not running, gone. One blink she was there, the next she wasn't. I sat frozen, hands shaking on the wheel, headlights shining on nothing but the empty road. The trees whispered with the breeze, but it was the only sound. My chest heaved like I'd been sprinting. Finally, I forced myself to drive. My knuckles stayed white on the wheel until I pulled into my driveway. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, expressionless, hollow, tilting toward me like she was about to speak. The next night, I told myself it had to be exhaustion. Maybe I'd imagined her. Maybe my brain had filled in shadows. But when midnight came again, I found myself back on that road. I didn't want to be there, but something inside me needed to know. The woods pressed against both sides, black and endless. My headlights cut through the dark, searching. The clock ticked past 12. And then I saw her, in the same spot, standing perfectly still. This time, I didn't brake until I was almost on top of her. My car shuddered to a stop just feet away. My pulse roared in my ears. She looked exactly the same. Same dress, same hair, same tilt of her head. I forced the door open and stepped out. My legs trembled. The night air was cold, but the moment I left the car, the temperature dropped sharper, like walking into a freezer. "Who are you?" I asked. Her eyes lifted to mine. They weren't normal. They weren't reflecting light. They were swallowing it, bottomless pits. I stumbled back. She took a step forward, and again, gone. One blink, empty road. My stomach lurched. I scrambled into the car, slammed the door, and floored it. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But every night afterward, I drove different routes, avoided that road, even if it took me an extra hour. Still, I couldn't escape the feeling she was watching me. I'd see flashes in my mirrors, something white flickering at the tree line. I'd hear faint knocks on my window while parked, though no one was there. Then came the dreams. Every night, I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart racing. In the dream, I was back on the road, but this time I couldn't move. The car was dead, the lights out. She walked toward me slowly, barefoot, dragging her dress through the dirt. Her lips would part, like she was about to whisper something. And then I'd wake, choking on my breath. It got worse. One night, I stayed late at a friend's place, hoping being around people would distract me. I didn't leave until nearly 12:30. By then, I was tired, careless, and I convinced myself to take the shortcut. The same road. Halfway down, my headlights flickered. My stomach dropped, and there she was, closer this time, just a few feet ahead, standing in the beams. I slammed the brake again, but the car died, engine coughing into silence. The dashboard went dark. She started walking toward me, slow, deliberate, bare feet slapping the pavement, her head still tilted, hair sticking to her cheeks. I locked the doors, fumbled with the keys, tried to restart the engine. Nothing. She reached the hood, her hand pressed flat against the metal, pale against the dark. I couldn't breathe. Then she leaned down, face close to the windshield. Her mouth moved. Just a whisper, no sound, and then, gone. The car roared back to life. Headlights flared, the road was empty. I drove 90 the rest of the way home. I thought about reporting it, calling police, telling them some woman was haunting the road. But I knew what they'd say. They'd laugh, call me tired, drunk, or crazy. Still, I needed answers. So I searched. It took hours, but eventually I found something. An old article online, buried deep. 20 years ago, a woman had been killed on that very road, hit by a drunk driver who never stopped. Witnesses said she was walking home from a party in a white dress. Her body wasn't found until morning. My skin went cold. Was it her? I told myself I wouldn't go back. I couldn't. But last night, something pulled me there again. It was exactly midnight. The woods felt thicker, pressing closer. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic like blood. My headlights cut through the black, and she was waiting, right in the center of the road. I didn't stop this time, I couldn't. I pressed the gas, heart hammering, telling myself she wasn't real. But as the car shot forward, she didn't move. Her face lit up in my beams, pale and hollow. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. And then, she was inside the car, sitting in the passenger seat. Her hair dripped against the fabric. Her dress clung to her thin frame. She turned her head slowly toward me, and I swear I felt the air grow heavy, crushing my chest. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. She leaned close, cold, breath brushing my ear. Her lips parted, whispering words I couldn't hear. I blinked, and she was gone. The seat was empty. The road stretched on, but the fabric where she'd sat was damp, and when I finally pulled into my driveway, shaken, I saw something in the reflection of the glass. A pale figure standing behind me, head tilted, watching. I don't drive at night anymore. I don't even sleep much. Every time I close my eyes, I see her lips moving, whispering words that never reach my ears. And I know, one night I won't wake up before she finishes, because she isn't gone. She's waiting, and she knows where I live. If you thought that was chilling, you haven't heard anything yet, because deep in those same woods, another story was unfolding. The first time I noticed the carvings, it was just after sunset. We had been hiking through a thick patch of Appalachian woods all day and finally settled near a small clearing to pitch our tents. The fire was still low, and the air was cooling fast, carrying that damp, earthy smell of moss and wet leaves. That's when I saw it. Letters carved into the bark of a pine tree just a few feet from my tent. They were deep, jagged cuts, like someone had pressed a knife into the trunk over and over. The letters weren't forming actual words, more like symbols, lines crossed, spirals, half-finished shapes. At first, I thought maybe they were old markings left by other hikers, but when I ran my fingers across them, the wood still felt raw, fresh, like it had been carved no more than a few hours earlier. I didn't mention it right away. We were already exhausted, and my friends, Ethan and Marissa, were in high spirits, cooking noodles over the fire and joking about bears. I didn't want to be the paranoid one. Still, I couldn't stop staring at that tree. The next morning, when the fog was still hanging low and pale over the clearing, I saw another one, this time on a tree much closer to where Ethan had slept. A symbol carved chest high, jagged and rough. It hadn't been there the night before. I was certain of it. I told them. Ethan laughed it off, saying locals probably use the trail for hunting and mark the trees. But Marissa looked uneasy. "It's too close," she whispered, brushing her hand over the grooves, like someone wanted us to see it. That night, I barely slept. The woods were too quiet. Even the usual rustling of raccoons or owls felt absent. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. The faint, deliberate scrape of metal against wood. My chest tightened. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, and that's when I saw the faint glow of a lantern swaying between the trees. Not a flashlight. A lantern, old-fashioned yellow light bleeding against the fog. It moved slowly, side to side, like whoever held it wanted to be seen. I shut the zipper instantly and pressed my hand against my mouth. I didn't breathe for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the light faded. When I finally dared to look again, the clearing was empty, but the smell of iron, sharp and metallic, lingered in the air. At dawn, we discovered 3 more trees marked overnight. One right by the fire pit, one carved lower, almost at the ground, as if for a child to see, and one right on the edge of camp, a deep spiral cut that looked more violent than the rest. Ethan was pale now. "Okay, someone's messing with us," he admitted. "We should pack up." But the problem was the trail back. We weren't sure we could make it out before dark, and none of us wanted to get caught in the woods at night with whoever or whatever was following us. So we stayed one more night, and it was the worst decision we could have made. Around midnight, the knocks started. Slow, hollow knocks echoing from tree to tree, circling us. My throat went dry. Marissa clutched my arm, whispering, "They're here." The lantern appeared again, closer this time, weaving between the marked trees. We couldn't see the person holding it, just the glow and the way it seemed to deliberately linger by each carving. Then, silence. The next morning, we found the last message, this time not just symbols, words, carved deep and clean across a tree directly facing our tents. "We see you." We left everything, tents, food, gear, and ran until we reached the ranger station. My legs burned, lungs ripped raw, but I didn't dare stop. When we came back, days later with the rangers, the campsite was stripped bare. No carvings, no tents, not even ashes from our fire pit. Just untouched forest, as if we'd never been there at all. I know what I saw. I know those trees were marked, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still smell that sharp, metallic tang and hear the sound of a knife dragging across bark in the dark. Story 7. We heard children laughing, deep in the Blue Ridge woods. I should have turned back the moment I heard the first child's laughter echoing through the forest at 3 in the morning. But my brother Danny was missing, and that laughter was coming from the direction he'd gone. Let me back up. Danny and I had been camping in the Blue Ridge Mountains near the North Carolina border, just the two of us trying to reconnect after years of growing apart. He was going through a rough divorce, and I'd been working too much. Our dad always said the mountains could heal anything, so we packed our gear and headed to this remote area he'd shown us as kids. The campsite was primitive. No facilities, no other campers, just a small clearing next to Whisper Creek about 8 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. Dad had called it our secret spot, though I'm sure other people knew about it. The kind of place where you could disappear for days and nobody would think to look for you. That should have been my second warning. We'd been there 2 days when Danny started acting strange. He kept saying he heard voices in the woods during the day, just at the edge of his hearing. When I'd stopped to listen, I never heard anything except wind in the trees and the creek running over rocks. "There it is again," he'd say, tilting his head like a dog hearing a whistle. "Kids playing. Don't you hear them?" I didn't. But Danny had always been more sensitive to things than me. As kids, he'd been the one who saw faces and shadows, who refused to go in certain rooms of our grandparents' old house. I'd learned not to dismiss what he experienced, even when I couldn't share it. On the second night, Danny woke me up around midnight, shaking my shoulder urgently. "They're calling my name," he whispered. "The kids. They want me to come play." I sat up in my sleeping bag, instantly alert. The forest around us was dead quiet. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just that oppressive silence that makes your ears feel plugged. "Danny, there are no kids out here. We're 8 miles from the nearest house." But he was already unzipping his sleeping bag, reaching for his boots. His eyes had a glazed look I'd never seen before, like he was sleepwalking with his eyes open. "I have to go," he said. "They're waiting for me." I grabbed his arm. "Danny, stop. You're dreaming or something. There's nobody out there." He looked at me then, and for just a moment his eyes cleared. "I'm sorry, Mike. I can't help it. I have to see." Before I could stop him, he was out of the tent and walking toward the tree line. I fumbled for my flashlight and followed, calling his name, but he was already disappearing into the darkness between the pines. I spent the rest of the night searching for him, calling until my voice was hoarse. When dawn broke, I hiked back to where we'd parked my truck and drove to the nearest town to get help. The sheriff's deputy, who took my report, was a tired-looking man named Williams, who seemed more annoyed than concerned. "Your brother's an adult," he said. "Maybe he just needed some space." Divorce can mess with a man's head. He was acting like he was hypnotized or something. and he went into the woods in the middle of the night wearing nothing but jeans and a t-shirt. Williams sighed and filled out a missing person report, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. He said they'd send someone out to look around, but with the budget cuts and the size of the forest, there wasn't much they could do unless Danny turned up injured or didn't come back in a few days. I couldn't wait a few days. I drove back to the campsite that afternoon with every piece of emergency gear I could buy: extra flashlights, flares, a GPS unit, enough food and water for a week. If Danny was lost in those mountains, I was going to find him. The first night alone at the campsite was the longest of my life. Every sound made me jump: branches creaking, leaves rustling, the creek gurgling in the darkness. I kept my fire burning bright and my flashlight within reach, checking my phone every few minutes even though I knew there was no signal. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. Faint but unmistakable. Children's voices drifting through the forest. High-pitched giggles and the sound of running feet on dead leaves. Coming from the same direction Danny had gone. My blood went cold. We were miles from any houses, any roads where families might camp. What were children doing out here in the middle of the night? I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The voices seemed to stay just ahead of me, always at the edge of my light's reach. I'd catch glimpses of movement between the trees, small shapes darting. Behind trunks, flashes of pale clothing in the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. "Are you kids okay? Are you lost?" The giggling stopped immediately. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard Danny's voice, clear as day. "Mike, over here. Come play with us." I ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my face, but I didn't care. Danny was alive, and he was calling for me. But when I reached the spot where his voice had come from, there was nothing. Just trees and darkness and the smell of rotting leaves. "Danny!" I shouted. "Where are you?" More laughter answered me, but it was coming from a different direction now. Multiple voices, children giggling like they were playing the best game of hide-and-seek ever invented. And underneath their laughter, I could hear Danny laughing too. I followed the sounds deeper into the forest, my flashlight growing dimmer as the battery drained. The voices always stayed just ahead of me, leading me further from camp, further from safety. Sometimes I'd see movement in my peripheral vision. Small figures running between the trees, always too quick to focus on. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a small clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood the ruins of an old stone foundation, maybe from a house or cabin that had been abandoned decades ago. Weeds and saplings grew through the broken stones, but I could still make out the outline of rooms, doorways, what might have been a fireplace. The children's laughter was louder here, echoing off the stones with an odd quality that made it sound like it was coming from underground. And there, sitting on the edge of the old foundation, was Danny. He looked perfectly normal, uninjured, alert, even smiling. But his eyes had that same glazed look they'd had when he left our tent. "Danny, thank God," I said, rushing toward him. "I've been looking everywhere for you. We need to get back to camp." He looked up at me with a puzzled expression. "Why would we go back?" The game's just getting started. That's when I saw them. Children emerging from the shadows around the clearing, maybe 8 or 10 of them. They looked like they were from different time periods, some in modern clothes, others in old-fashioned dresses and knickers that belonged in a history book. Their faces were pale in my flashlight beam, but their eyes were bright with excitement. "We've been playing all day," Danny said. "Hide and seek, tag, Red Rover. They know the best games, Mike. Games we never learned as kids." I took a step back, my skin crawling. These weren't normal children. There was something wrong with the way they moved, the way they stood perfectly still, except for their eyes, which never stopped watching me. "Danny, we need to leave, now." But he was already standing, walking toward the children with that sleepwalker's gait. "Don't be scared, Mike. They just want to play. They've been waiting so long for someone to play with them." One of the children, a little girl in a faded blue dress, stepped forward. Her voice was sweet and innocent, but it made my teeth ache. "We've been playing here for years and years," she said, "but grown-ups always leave. They get scared, or they get hungry, or they remember things they're supposed to do. But we never leave. We play forever." "How long have you been here?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The girl tilted her head, thinking. "Since the house burned down, since Mama and Papa went to sleep and never woke up. We've been waiting for someone to play with us properly." My flashlight beam caught something in the ruins behind her. Small white shapes scattered among the stones. Bones, I realized with horror. Small bones, child-sized, bleached white by decades of weather. These weren't children. They were something else, something that had been children once. "Danny," I said urgently, "we're leaving now." But Danny was already joining their circle, taking the pale girl's hand with a smile I'd never seen on his face before. The other children closed in around him, and they began to move in a slow, hypnotic dance. "Come play, Mike," Danny called without looking at me. "Don't be afraid." It's the most fun I've ever had. The children began to sing, a wordless melody that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound wrapped around my head like fog, making it hard to think clearly. I felt my feet starting to move toward them, drawn by the innocent joy in their voices. But then my flashlight died, plunging the clearing into near-total darkness. The sudden absence of light broke whatever spell was being woven, and I could think clearly again. I ran. I crashed through the forest in complete darkness, branches whipping my face, roots catching my feet. Behind me, the children's laughter grew louder, more excited. They were chasing me, their bare feet silent on the forest floor, but their giggles echoing from every direction. I don't know how I found my way back to camp. Maybe it was luck, maybe some survival instinct I didn't know I had. But when I stumbled into the clearing where our tent sat, dawn was just breaking through the trees. I packed everything in record time and hiked out to my truck. I drove straight to the sheriff's office and told Deputy Williams everything. The voices, the children, the ruins, what had happened to Danny. Williams listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard too many crazy stories from people lost in the woods. "Mr. Chen," he said when I finished, "you've been in the forest for 3 days by yourself. No food, no sleep, probably dehydrated. The mind can play tricks under those conditions. Then, explain where my brother is. Maybe he hiked out while you were lost. Maybe he went home to deal with his divorce. People do strange things when they're stressed, but I knew better. I drove back to Danny's apartment in Richmond. His car was still, parked outside, covered in 3 days' worth of pollen. His mail was overflowing. His neighbor said she hadn't seen him since he left for our camping trip. That was 6 months ago. Danny is still officially missing. The search teams found our campsite and the clearing where I'd last seen him, but they said there were no ruins there, no stone foundation, just trees and more trees. But I know what I saw, and sometimes when the wind is right and the night is quiet, I can still hear them. Children's laughter drifting through the darkness, joyful and eternal. They're still playing their games in those mountains, and somewhere among them, Danny is laughing too, having more fun than he's ever had in his life. The sheriff was right about one thing. The mind can play tricks when you're lost in the woods, but some tricks never end. Sometimes they follow you home and whisper in your dreams, calling you back to play. I moved to Arizona last month. Desert as far as you can see in any direction. No forests, no trees, no places for children to hide and play their eternal games. But last night, I heard giggling outside my bedroom window, and a voice I knew too well calling my name. "Come play, Mike. We're still waiting."